These are all mortal awards. I don't understand them. Her books have been translated into 32 languages worldwide and adapted for film. She currently lives in New England with her husband and son in a house with a secret library. You can visit her later at www.blackholly.com, but for now, she is right here. And joining us is her fellow scribe, Leigh Bardugo. I'm told these two are both very famous in the mortal world. Leigh is the New York Times bestselling author of Ninth House and the creator of the Grishaverse, coming soon to Netflix, which spans the Shadow and Bone trilogy, the Six of Crows duology, the King of Scars duology, the Language of Thorns, and her most recent, The Lives of Saints, on sale now, with more to come, including The Rule of Wolves in March of next year. Her short stories can be found in multiple anthologies, including Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy. Leigh grew up in Southern California and graduated from Yale University. These days, she lives and writes in Los Angeles. Now, I will leave the stage to them as I enjoy my fairy fruit and fairy wine.
Oh, that was good. That was good stuff. Now I want to do the whole event this way. No, foolish mortals. I love that in part. Hello, Holly Black. The beautiful, delightful Holly Black. I kind of love that because that also is kind of the Holly Black voice. So
oh, it's kind of hello. Hello. I always thought I was sort of doing that because you do it, though.
I thought I was doing it because you do it, so. I definitely got Who Can Say from you, and I actually wrote it into Rule of Wolves. And every time I read for copy edits, I'm like, who can say? Who can say? So I'm so delighted to be here with you. I have been a fangirl of Cruel Prince and this whole world and Jude and Carden story since you were kind enough to give me an early draft to read. And I have a very clear memory of going to retreat and reading it on the way there at a workshop. And I really didn't know what to expect because you had pitched this a while back to me, like you had described it a while back. And I will confess at the time I was like, why are there so many princes? This is too confusing, cut down. And you were like, they're all gonna die, so it doesn't really matter. But I'd love to know, I know I hate the like, where did you get the idea? But what I'd love to know is what, you know, we have so many ideas to write. What about this one wouldn't let you go?
I really loved the idea of that sort of is the prologue, the idea of a reverse changeling, of someone who is immortal, who grows up in faerie and who has to navigate this really difficult environment. And I really like the idea of having these two people who absolutely do not want to have anything in common, but who are the only people who understand each other.
Yeah, love it. The idea of the reverse changeling, you've written about changelings before in Darkest Part of the Forest. So they create a kind of terrifying, it sort of takes the fish out of water to its most extreme. Do you think that Jude or Carden sort of started speaking first?
I mean, I don't think I have ever gone into a project knowing as much as I did about this one. And so I normally am really finding my way through a story in a way that there were a lot of things I didn't know, but I actually knew who both of them were from the beginning. And, you know, people have asked me a few times, did anyone surprise you in this book? And I think that they're talking about Carden. And I was like, no, I couldn't have written this book if I didn't know
who he
was going to do.
Yeah.
But I also really needed to know who Jude was and, you know, what are the things that she needed to hear and needed to happen for her to become a very different person than the person she starts the book as being.
So you started out knowing a lot about this. You were writing in a familiar world. Yeah, that was sort of a different amount of what was sort of there to work with. For me, the surprise after like the way the story begins and also the way you had described it to me was how much I loved Maddock. I love a stern daddy figure because it was great. Like, I love him. He's such a fantastic and horrible mentor, and that really took me by surprise. What was different from the time you sort of envisioned and were writing up what you were going to write to the final product? Did anything change in a big way? Or was everything sort of in place and stayed that way?
Well, so when I wrote it, I thought, I wrote the first half thinking I have this, and I wrote the second half thinking this is a mess. And then I took it to a workshop and everyone was like, the second half is perfect, don't touch it. The first half is a total wreck. and so I really, because I had, so there's almost a misdirection in the sense that there's a whole piece where Carden is the villain of the book, and then it shifts over, and people, like, it was tricky. It was a trickier piece of business than I thought it was to try and get Jude through all of that with motivations that felt strong enough. So I think that was really hard. And then, the thing with Matic is, I don't know if this is good or bad, but this is the first series that I have written, and Cruel Prince is the first book I have written beginning to end as a parent.
Sorry, I'm trying to get more light in the room.
And so I feel like as a new parent, maybe I identify with Matic.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like,
wow, that is dangerous, and how CPS gets called. I think what's fascinating is that I think I love seeing parents in YA because you don't see them that often, whether they're good or bad. And for like Brimstone in Lainey's series, Daughter of Smoke and Bone, and Maddox are these kind of characters who are at once incredibly harsh, but also very they bring out the best in their children, even if it's through horrific means. So since we're talking about this dynamic and how difficult that this dynamic is to pull off, let's really talk about it, because this is about a bully. Carden is a bully. This is, and a pretty vicious one. Mm-hmm. What was the balancing act on that? Because whenever I would read your drafts, I'd be like, make him meaner, make him meaner.
It was incredibly good advice, and I needed to hear it, because I think, when I first thought this is the project I want to do, I also thought, what am I thinking? Like, this is going to be really hard, and I'm not sure how to do it, and it could easily become something that I don't want it to be. And I think the thing I had to hold on to is that, so Carden needs to be a kind of petty evil, right? He is not quite what he seems, right? He's trying to seem really like a big evil. And he does, I think, when we meet him, seem like he could be. And for Jude, he represents an enormous amount of things she's frightened of. And so in her mind, he becomes bigger than he is. He becomes, a more malevolent and powerful force than he really is. And so she becomes the person who can fight that person. And so when they have their confrontation, she's like, finally, I have become your equal, and now we will fight. And he's like, you are terrifying, and I think you killed someone, and this is not what I signed up for at all. Like, I am awful, but at a totally different scale.
He's definitely JV, and Jude is varsity.
Right, and he's like, and I think that's the thing is that he is awful, but on a different scale.
Very much so. Very much so. And I think there's an interesting question that is sort of played out over all of the books about how far Carden will go. And what usually stops him is not some authority figure or even Jude, it's his own sense of unease when he encounters true evil.
Right. I mean, I don't think he thinks a lot about meanness as being that bad, which is not okay. But he really thinks that death is forever and truly horrific.
Yeah.
In a way that not everybody does. Certainly Matic doesn't. He's like, meh.
Yeah, well, Matic has killed a lot of people. So if he took death seriously, he would probably have a lot of very sad nights. So I think it's interesting that you said that Carden is embodies sort of everything that Jude fears, because I think if I were to characterize, so one of the reasons I fell in love with this series was because the world really reminded me of sort of the promise of Labyrinth. Never quite got there, but the promise is basically the masquerade scene in Labyrinth. And I describe this just as like sexy danger, you know? And Carden is very much sexy danger, but like what draws us to that? Why are we so compelled by that?
I think that we, one of the things that fantasy can do is take our feelings and, you know, move them into the realm of metaphor, right? And so I think we experience attraction as danger to our self-esteem, you know, danger to our hopes. And I think that it feels, I think that the level of fraughtness we feel can be writ large into somebody who is dangerous on a different scale, because when you're reading a book, you cannot necessarily, it's not true. You can get into those pieces, but that does a different thing. That is a direct thing. Whereas I feel like in metaphor, we are allowed not to have to see ourselves quite as clearly and to experience the emotions we have without necessarily questioning them. Yeah. Like, you know, if you see somebody in a situation in which they're meeting somebody, we're not necessarily entirely on board with their level of nervousness and their level of a fear and maybe even anger that person has some kind of power over them and some kind of control and, you know, the potential to hurt them. But when we take everything into metaphor, we don't have to question it anymore. We get to just experience it.
I wonder if we also feel there's a safety net that's built into this kind of fiction, in the sense that we know that somebody, at least in a young adult book, is not going to introduce a character or love interest who's really going to damage the other person in an irreparable way or in a cruel way. Even though it is called The Cruel Prince, we know that there's something. It's like, I love watching a cozy mystery, like a British cozy, because I know like nothing really gruesome is going to happen. Like, yeah, somebody will get murdered, but then like there will be tea and, you know, much discussion, and nothing like really gross or brutal is going to happen in this story. And I wonder if that is sort of keeping us safe as we enjoy the kind of friction of sexy danger.
I think there are conventions of the form. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing that I hoped people would feel, which is one of my favorite things in books, is when you like the idea of somebody maybe being the romantic interest, but you think, I'm never going to get that. You know, I really hoped that people might feel that way, and then even feel like, what are we doing? Like, what's happening?
Like, dangerous, man. That's a dangerous game to play in YA. Like, you walk that tightrope very well. That's a very scary game. Yeah.
Very surprising thing that people got on board with it.
It wasn't really surprising to me. Like, I remember reading that draft, and I think, look, I'm going to make a confession here. Like, I love being CPs to people, but sometimes you start a draft and you don't know what you're going to get. Like, you don't know what kind of shape it's going to be in. And I remember being on the plane and you had only given me like 60 pages or something, maybe 100 pages. And I was like, what the hell, Holly? Like, what the hell? Like, where's the rest of it? Like, I got so invested and transported by this. So I was not remotely surprised that this was, I think it is one of the most delicious books, like series I've ever read, and it just gets better and better as it goes, which, you know, it's not always the case. I'm going to switch gears slightly, go further back in time, but I want to remind people that they can submit questions, and I will ask those questions of Holly in just a bit. But I'm wondering, you know, so I have started to recognize certain things in stories that lock me into a world, and they're basically the same things that locked me in when I was like 14 years old. So my first question is like, what was young Holly like? Like, who was young Holly who was attending, you know, high school or junior high school, and how has Holly changed? But also, like, do you have the same story triggers essentially?
I think I probably do, although I don't think I could have parsed them at all. So I started out as an extreme high fantasy reader and only a high fantasy reader.
Oh.
And I think I came to contemporary fantasy from a couple of directions. One was definitely reading vampire books. You know, I read Interview with the Vampire. I bought it for 25 cents at a garage sale. And I thought, this looks maybe too scary for me, because I was extremely easily frightened child. I was extremely paranoid. And I loved it. And I read it so many times. And I think that probably was the thing that started to make me imagine a world in which you could have fantasy here and now.
It's funny. I think that book, like almost every writer I know remembers when they read that book. Like I bought the paperbacks for my friend for her birthday because she asked me to. Mm-hmm. And then I was like, well, I'll pick this up and read it before I give it to her because I'm cheap. And, you know, completely fell into this intense world. So that was one of your doorways to this different kind of fantasy. But you kind of sidestepped my question, which was who was Holly Black?
I loved writing. I was I was, you know, obviously a weirdo. I had very long bangs. I'm very excited to have my bangs back. I had bangs for
they suit you so well, and I'm very jealous.
Long time. My friend and I growing up, a girl named Rohana, we did a lot of like hair stuff. Like I had shaved half my head. She had a mohawk. We had like colored hair before anyone else did. We had a very rough time in school. You know, I really always wanted to be a writer. Mm-hmm. I have all of these like, you know, bits of manuscripts and, you know, things like that. I always did my eyes like this. I mean,
that's why you're so good at eyeliner. I've had to learn during quarantine. I could do it on other people, the line, but I could never do it on myself. So you were, let's say, an outsider, like in your youth, and you were very passionate about writing. When do you think you got serious about it? Or do you think it was always like, this is what I'm going to do?
I was pretty serious about it when I was in like middle school. And then I think in high school, I slacked off, and through college, I slacked off.
Did you have a plan, like a non-writer plan? Like, I'm going to be a float designer, or I don't know why that's the first thing that came to mind, but it was.
I didn't have a very concrete plan. I assumed I would get a job. Like, I didn't think I would be a writer professionally. Like, I'd get some kind of job. And so, for a while, I thought maybe I would be a teacher, because one of the schools I went to did a lot of teaching stuff. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading the year's best science fiction and fantasy when I was going into my junior year, and reading in the back and realizing like all these people knew each other. And I suddenly thought, I want to work in publishing. I don't care what happens. Because the idea of being part of a community of writers, I think, was a huge draw. And I changed all my classes and thought, okay, I'm going to go somewhere into publishing.
Yeah.
And I did, but I went into medical publishing. So it was not.
You did not know that.
Yeah, I was a production editor on medical journals, like the Journal of Hand Surgery and the Journal of Pain.
Which will be the fourth book in the Cruel Prince trilogy, and the Folk of the Air will be the Journal of Pain. That will be the 2020 journal, is the journal.
Oh, that's so true.
It's so true. So when we're going to go to questions soon, because I can already see them stacking up, but I got a few more. So I guess there are certain things that I loved that I know were formative for me, but that now have not aged so well. Like, are there things for you that you still love, even though you know they're bad, or that, you know, you might be passionate about, but like that you wouldn't recommend to someone? Like, or things you love that nobody else does?
I mean, oh, that's hard. It's a hard question.
I know that's a tough one. I don't
When
want
you first started it, I thought you were just going to ask, like, what are the things, you know what I mean? So I had like formed an idea in my mind. I think
answer the question you wish I'd asked.
this isn't that helpful to the question, but maybe while I'm answering it, I think the thing, like when I look at like the book I owe my whole career to,
Yes.
this illustrated book, Brian Fred and Alan Lee's book Fairies. Which
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has seen it, but if you have not, you should go look for it. Brian Fred did the concept art for Dark Crystal and Labyrinth.
And Labyrinth.
And Alan Lee did the concept art for Lord of the Rings. And here they are in this like little English town in the 70s, making these like beautiful, terrifying fairies.
Yeah.
Many naked, a lot of naked fairies in that book. It came out around the same time as gnomes. Many naked gnomes in that book. You never saw gnomes?
No, I don't like gnomes. They wig me out.
Well, friend.
It's not my jam. Why do I have the feeling I'm getting what my Christmas present is gonna be?
But I think that book scared me. I was such a like an easily frightened kid. I
don't think like what changed, because I think of you as being like you watch horror movies, like you will pick up a frog.
I don't like horror movies. I will pick up a frog. I mean, I'll pick up a frog right now.
Or like you seem fairly fearless around creatures, at least.
Around creatures, I do like a creature, but I think because my mom always talked about our house as haunted. I grew up with a very specific sense that the supernatural was out to get me. So yeah, I think
interesting. And then you become this kind of writer who has control over the supernatural.
It's what we do with our fears, right?
I suppose so. So that book was very formative. Were there other touchstones for you?
Kenneth Lee is a British fantasy writer, very ornate language. I was part of this. I joined the, there was this thing that you could join when I was a kid where you would get a mailer. And if you didn't want the books, it was a science fiction book club, right? And if you didn't want the books, you had to check something and send it back. Well, I was a very, very disorganized child. So I got all kinds of books that I did not want.
Criminal. That is a scam. Is what that is.
There used to be, do you remember these? They used to be for tapes too. Like audio tapes?
We had CDs. It was the Columbia House like music club. Oh, yeah.
See, that was the same thing. You had to remember to send it in or you got it.
Yeah.
So I got all of these. So that's how I found an enormous amount of fantasy writers of that period were books I didn't want, but now had. But some of them were great.
That's good. That's good. What about guilty pleasures? Is there anything that like, I will give you one because this is very embarrassing to me, but I'm going to just say it. I love the music of Sting. Like I recognize.
I just wasn't embarrassed. When I was a very small child, I loved Duran Duran.
Oh, well, who didn't? I mean,
I like that.
Talk about sexy danger. Just going out on a boat, not really even know anything about boat safety. Amazing.
Sure, in my misspent youth, I also enjoyed Sting due to his seeming like he maybe knew something about fantasy novels.
He did. I think it's all of the like many stringed instruments definitely give you that vibe. But I have the feeling if I ever met him, he would treat me with disdain. So I don't ever want to meet him.
But I was also a big Black Sabbath fan at that time.
Of course you were. Hates horror movies, loves Black Sabbath.
Also knew their way around a fantasy novel. Basically, if you seemed like you had read a fantasy novel, I was in.
Okay, well, I want to talk about this particular book briefly before we go into into the talk. But I'm curious to know, it's so beautiful. I love the illustrations. It's such a fun story. It's really fun to see Carden and Jude together, not trying to murder each other too much. So was there anything different? You knew you were writing this to be illustrated, correct?
Yes.
So was the process different in any way? Did you leave gaps for the, like in this, I don't mean gaps like were there spaces in the story that you thought, oh, this is going to be an illustration, or I want to leave room for her to draw something, or did you write it the same way you write everything?
I mean, that's a great question. I didn't specifically think about leaving space, but I definitely thought about the making sure we had a lot of different locations, like, you know, and also selfishly things I wanted to see, like the door, and you know, I thought about that, but I didn't really think about, okay, what specifically is Rowena going to do here?
Right.
I figured she would come to it, you know, with whatever she thought would be interesting.
And did you work directly with her, or was it the sort of the publisher working with her and then giving you, like, was there a middleman?
There was a middleman. We were separated.
How it always works for me too. I think they keep us away from the illustrators so we don't drive them nuts.
That's right. I think that's right.
Yeah, and it's nice because then you can stay friends after the whole thing.
But she was so wonderful to work with, and I think her work is just so emotional.
Very, very beautiful, just really extraordinary and super. There's, when you flip through this, like there's not like they are not lush. It's not lush art, but it's incredibly evocative, very haunting. You know, it definitely gets that spirit of faerie, I think, wonderfully. Okay, I am gonna go to some questions now. The first one is from Ghost Lilies, which is such a pretty name. I like that. What is your writing process? Is it difficult to stay productive right now? She said it's for both of us.
Ooh, ooh. Do you want, I've answered a lot of questions. What's your writing process? Has it been hard to stay productive right now?
Screaming on the inside. Look, yes, it has been hard for me. It hasn't so much been hard for me to stay productive on existing projects. Like, I wrote Rule of Wolves almost entirely in quarantine. And there were certain elements of that that were like really pleasurable because it was so nice to not be in my apartment and to be in Ravka instead, and to be facing big evil and that was fightable and that was, you know, dramatic and exciting and wears great clothes, as opposed to what we've been fighting at home. So there was an element of sort of escape and comfort in that. But I will say it has been harder for me to focus on new projects with the same sort of attention and willingness to sort of like forward momentum. And I think that's largely about sort of being in this confined space. You know, I had a routine, I had a method for ways that I would juice my creativity,
Right.
and they're sort of gone now. How about you?
So I've been doing some writing. I've been working on an adult book, and I was feeling pretty good about the fact that I was still being productive. And, you know, I had friends who were telling me that they couldn't even read, that they weren't getting anything done. And then post-election, I suddenly realized everything that was wrong with the book. And I thought, I think this has been like my Close Encounter style mountain of mashed potatoes that I've been making. I think I've been writing, but maybe not to a purpose. Like I've just been like anxiety generating a lot of material.
I'm getting a very like all work and no play makes Holly a dull girl. But I also find that you think your drafts are much worse than they actually are. Like you'll be like, it's broken. It's just broken. There's nothing. I'm like, it's not broken.
I understand what you're saying. However, this is the first time that, like in a fairy tale, I would write by day and delete by night. like I was weaving and then unweaving the story.
Oh no. This is very distressing.
It was all very weird. I definitely think that there have been moments this year where I felt like it's been great to write because I can step away from the world. And
Yes.
there's moments this year where I thought, I don't think I know what I'm doing.
I mean, I feel like I have moments like that regardless of pandemics and elections. Like I frequently feel like I don't know what I'm doing. And I think that process, which is what Ghost Lily's asked about, is really about having something to fall back on when you are in the grips of doubt and anxiety. And my process sort of never changes. It is outline and then flesh that outline out, like go from essentially having a 1-page book to having, a 30-page book to, 100-page, and I don't mean that, I don't write linearly. So I'm always sort of adding flesh to that skeleton, and it doesn't really walk and talk until at least the second draft, I think.
And my process is to come up with an idea, to outline it, to write some of it, to burn that outline to the ground, to start over. New characters, a new plot, a new villain, and a new magic system, re-outline it right to the middle, burn that to the ground.
No! It's not good to do that. But this makes me super curious to read whatever you've created, because I imagine is radically different from what you originally wrote. So that is a message to all of the writers out there to not be afraid to throw away your precious, precious words. Burn it all to the ground, apparently. Brenna Sullivan wants to know, will there be any future sequels or novellas that have to do with the folk of the air? I would like to know that too, Holly Black.
I would definitely like to write some more folk of the air books. Possibly not with the same focus, but I would love to write in that space again. I've been writing fairy books since 2002. So I think it is, certainly true that I'm not going to stop. And I think there are a lot of loose ends with different characters that I would like to see where they could go. I would like to have an excuse to check in on Matic in the human world.
I would like that too.
For my own pleasure.
I like to imagine him going to Costco. It's just going down the aisles at Costco and tipping things over one by one. Okay, Daniel Joel asks, any advice for getting back into writing and reading things you love after university? I'm assuming, because this person has been in the work of trying to get through a degree and so forth. So reigniting an excitement about words.
Well, I don't know what your advice will be, but I will tell you that when I came out of college, probably my biggest problem was that I had internalized a lot of ideas about what writing ought to be and ought to do.
Yes.
When I sat down to write, I was trying to write for my writer self. I was trying to write the right way. And, and I had lost touch with reader pleasure. I had lost touch with my own reader self. And I think that I struggled writing my first book for many years. And I think a huge part of the reason why was that I could not let go of these ideas of what the book should be. And I hadn't gone at that thing that, that reader pleasure that we were trying, what is the stuff, right? What's the stuff that makes you want to pick something up, want to not put it down. And that stuff feels kind of shameful. It's not the stuff you talk about in college.
No, it's not. And I think that is wonderful to hear, because I went through a very similar thing. And I also remember being in, and I found it really froze me up. I would, because you're writing to some kind of bizarre golden ideal that makes no sense at all. But I remember also being in a poetry, I don't know what word just came out of poetry.
I thought you were going to say pedagogy.
A pedagogy. I also just said a poetry scimitar, which would have been more exciting than a poetry seminar, but it was a poetry seminar. And there was sort of one alpha in the class, and we all sort of started writing like him. It was so on the one hand, college can be this incredible, great experience where you get to read lots of things outside of your comfort zone and meet cool people and all that good stuff. But I do think it tampers with our own sort of sense of what we like and what we love. And you described it as reader pleasure. I always call it like the id, that thing that's drawing us into our work. And I think, at least for me, writing my first novel was so much about remembering the pleasure of a chosen one story, like the pleasure of sexy danger and of great clothes, like that's very much like, and you're right, we are sort of taught that those are shameful things. So in terms of concrete advice, I would say, maybe step out of what you've been reading right now and read some kids books, read different genres, maybe try an audiobook, and in terms of writing yourself, take some of the pressure off. Maybe get a writing journal, or just get Google writing prompts, and maybe challenge yourself for 1 month to every morning just write 250 words to a writing prompt. That's it. Take all the pressure off. And don't think that you have to write like the great American novel right away. You do actually have time to write the great American novel. Okay. Ness Morrison asks, what is it about the Fae that entices you to write about them, not just in The Folk of the Air, but Darkest Part of the Forest? And I should also mention, if you haven't read Tithe or Valiant, all these earlier fairy books, they're incredible. But what keeps you coming back?
I think there's a couple things that I love about fairies. One is, unlike other supernatural creatures, they are not human and never were human. When you look at the werewolf, the werewolf is human some of the time. The vampire was human. Here you have a being that might look like us, but is not us. And I'm really fascinated with that. I also love that fairy is an ecosystem, right? It's not just like elves. It's, nixies and pixies and trolls and sprites. And it has, a whole world built into it. But the thing I think I keep coming back to is the idea of fairy fruit. The idea that there's something so delicious that everything else that you have will be dust and ashes in your mouth. You definitely should not eat it, but it's so good. Maybe you could just have a little taste. Like the idea of ruinous beauty.
Yeah, and it's so deep into that world. Like, talk about something that hooks you in. Like, I think that that's something that we go searching for our whole lives. The worlds we create and the houses we try to decorate, like we are searching for that intense, ruinous feeling of being transported, that is somewhat hard to come by in our human mortal world.
Right, of transformation, right? Of the idea we are often searching, I think, for transformation. I think I decorate my house towards an idea of like, you know what I mean? If the house will be a certain way, or if I will be a certain way, or if I find this, the right blazer, like I will become that person.
Our entire culture is geared toward the idea of sort of the spiritual and physical makeover, and I think one of the beautiful things I've seen in culture over the last, say, 5 years is a move away from, when I was a makeup artist, everybody wanted natural beauty, right? Natural beauty, smoky eye, natural beauty. And now you have people who are like, I want to look monstrous. I want to look like a mermaid. I want to look like one of the Fae. Like, that is thrilling to me, to see people filter beauty through a different lens.
That has been my quarantine. My weird quarantine obsession is beauty products. I think because I threw out a ton of old makeup and I thought I will get a little bit of new makeup. There is stuff out there that I would never have dreamed existed. There are companies who make things that I never would have dreamed existed, like really like unnatural makeup, and beautiful unnatural makeup.
You should do a holiday gift guide, Holly Black, so that we can all partake of the unnatural makeup. Speaking of fairy fruit, you're like, I'll just buy a little bit of makeup. Just a little bit, it'll be fine. Okay, so we only have time for a couple more questions. So Shelby Thiessen asks, did you always know the ending of Queen of Nothing?
No. I knew I knew who would wind up where. Like nothing of that changed. Mm-hmm. But I had a whole different plot, which you will remember. We talked about it sitting, I believe, in your extremely cold room. Was that great with Kelly? That you guys extremely cold.
Like to be cold.
Like to be cold. In Italy? Is that correct?
In the middle of the heat. Yeah.
talking about it, and I had this this idea that there were gonna be giants and there's gonna be all this stuff, and I knew there was something wrong with it, but I couldn't think of what. It seemed totally straightforward that this is what, I knew there was a northern army. I knew some of that stuff all is true. It was just sort of the mechanics of it. And I remember coming on a different retreat and being like, this isn't right, but I don't know why, and I'm gonna have to figure it out. And Sarah Rees Brennan said, well, this is kind of a Tamlin story. And in that moment, I thought, oh, right, it is a Tamlin story. And also, if this is going to be, this is Jude's journey toward, there's a couple questions she needs to answer at the end of this book, which is, how much is she willing to give up for power? Is she willing to give up the world? Is she willing to give up love? Is she willing to give up family? Is she going to give up her sense of what it means to be human? And I need to put that to her. I need to find a way to put that to her. And also, if she's going to be the queen in faerie, then she needs to be the queen without anybody helping her out. She can't be, the queen married to a faerie king. She has to be a human queen on her own. Oh dear.
One of the things I love so much about Jude's journey is her skill, her intelligence, these things that were honed through this sort of horrific childhood serve her so well. And she never gets a free pass. She never gets like a sudden level up. The level ups always come through her own ability to survive or to sort of change the game of that her enemies want to play. I love it.
Well, if I didn't do that, you would have just made me do that. So I'm sure that at times I tried.
Maybe Carden, note the second. Jude is being weird.
But I came back with the snake, and then I remember, oh my God, my critique partner from like my very first, he kept being like, how are you going to do this? You can't do this.
I was not that wigged out by the snake. I remember you telling me about the snake, and I was like, a bold choice. But I also wasn't the wigged out because I was like, well, snakes are cool. It's not like you're turning him into a prairie dog, like a snake is menacing and exciting. There's many snakes.
Enormous chicken.
I mean, that's not sexy danger. There's nothing that says, for somebody, I'm sure. Okay, one last question. And it's a big one, so I shouldn't have left end, but we'll hit this one and then we will say our goodbyes. Annalise Nilsson asks about world building, about creating a complex fantasy world. This is, I think probably one of the number one things we all get asked about. It's a sort of a big one. How do you do it?
So this is a good story here, which is that Lee came to my town to do an event, and I spent much of her Q&A asking her questions about world building because I was like, how do you come up with all the street names? I have another question.
I was very grateful. There were not a lot of people at that event.
There were, I'm sure that they had questions. They kept waving their hand, but I had more questions. But I think the thing I have realized about world building is that the thing I need to know is what is the thematic and textural element of the world. Like, what does this world feel like? What is this world about? What is the metaphorical weight of this magic? And that sounds like really obscure, but I feel like it actually makes everything much more concrete for me, because if you're telling a story that's about fairies, there's certain kinds of magic that's right for that world. Like, I had to come up with something like the Lake of Masks, because there's stuff in, there's not a lot set in fairy in terms of like fairy folklore. And the Lake of Masks to me feels like a fairy thing because it's weird. It has it is like a little bit grim, but mostly useless. And that feels really fairy to me. And if you're going to then do something that's like in a world in which there are vampires, there are things that come with that, that have sort of textural weight.
Yes.
And that has been probably my biggest realization in terms of like how to cut down all of the work of making cool stuff that doesn't actually feel right.
Right.
Why it doesn't feel right. And then the other thing, which I have realized recently, is that you can come up with as much cool stuff as you want, but if it doesn't generate story, it's got to go. That is a huge part of the problems I had with this new book. I kept coming up with cool stuff that did not generate story.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
I'm sure you have much better advice, which I will leave to you
I
now.
I think you and I approach novels very differently in terms of sort of what we need to know before we begin. And I think that a big part of all of this for me is, for me, the structure of the story sort of comes first. And that's why it has to remain malleable. I see the terror in your eyes. If I can't think of sort of where I want to get my characters to for the midpoint, for the end, I'm really sort of rudderless. And then, but when it comes to the building of the world, it is all about, this is, I think, where we cross paths, is really is all about the emotional feeling that I want somebody to get from it. You know, there's magic that is pleasurable, and there's magic that is not dangerous, and there's magic that is bloody, and there's magic that is academic. And thinking about how those things intersect with what my characters, the journey that they're about to go on, I think is how sort of the sort of fundamental spirit of the world gets built. But the one piece of advice I would give is it will not all happen at once. You know, I think there's this dream that we have where you're going to come up with this spectacular world, you're going to populate it, you're going to draw maps, you're going to have all of these ideas, and then you're going to write the book and it's all going to be in place. And at least for me, that has never been the case. You know, there are things you know going in. For me, it's usually the basics of how power functions. And then there's so much that has to be discovered in the process of writing. And so I would say, especially in your first draft, again, let yourself off the hook. Let there be placeholders. Let it be trite. You know, you will find your way there through getting the characters on the page. And the danger of spending all of your time drawing maps and writing character histories and figuring out the different kinds of magic is that it keeps you from the draft. It can become a hiding place from the work of writing a book. So
it's true. And I think you do, from writing, figure out what's wrong with the magic, right? Because if the magic isn't helpful for the story, that's when you figure out, oh, I have to figure out this differently, rather than, I mean, books are they are the worst thing that can happen to a protagonist. Like, they are calibrated to take every single thing that person pushed down emotionally, didn't deal with emotionally, feared, hoped they would never have to see, right? And every single one of them is going to happen to that person. And so, I mean, because of that, that is like, whatever is in service of that has to happen.
And I think this is also a great time to touch back on the idea of reader pleasure. It's great to talk about a complex fantasy world, but think about what really gives you pleasure from a book. You know, is it about the food? Is it about the magic? Is it about the place? You know, each world you build is going to be specific to what you are hungering for. And I think being in touch with that hunger is pretty vital to creating these things instead of it just becoming an academic exercise. So, yeah. All right. Holly, thank you. Please, a reminder, if you haven't bought The King of Elfhame, you should. And there's a special edition from Barnes & Noble that is extremely beautiful and that you can get on bn.com.
bn.com.
The internet will tell you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been a little strange not to see people chatting in the thing. I just see the questions pop up, but I hope you all enjoyed. And Holly, it was so wonderful to see your beautiful face.
Oh, it's so wonderful to see you too. Thank you so much for coming to hang out with me and asking me so many good questions.
Yay!